Professor Salman Sayyid, who is the Professor of Social Theory and Decolonial Thought. He's also the Head of School of Sociology. Professor Sayyid is an internationally renowned intellectual and authored The Fundamental Fear, Eurocentrism and the Rise of Islamism, and also the Recalling the Caliphate. Professor Sayyid is the founding editor of the Reorient, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies. So I'd like to call upon Professor Salman Sayyid to come to the stage to deliver his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tolerance is really, really easy. It's real life which is really hard. And in a way, when we talk about tolerance and we talk about some of these questions in the context of a university setting or in terms of a learning setting, it doesn't seem to be a hard sell to me. It's a condition of possibility for all learning, as Mustafa pointed out. And you can see this through the kind of example of Sayyid Mufti Amin Ullah Hassan's life as well, that you can see the way that tolerance opens you up to understanding things. But let me ask you a question which, in a way, Taj answered at the beginning, but let me ask it again in a different register. Can Muslims be ecumenical? And the reason I ask this question is, if you turn on your TV, you will find the answer to the question is, no, of course not. And if you try and understand the world outside the university, the answer will be, no, it can't be. And the reason is partly because the idea of being Muslims, being ecumenical in a kind of political context is really, really problematic. It's really difficult for people to imagine that possibility. When you talk about Islam or you talk about Muslims, you're often talking about the idea of those who are against being tolerant, those who are very strident in their beliefs, those who do not want to engage with or integrate into wider society. So if that's the kind of prevailing way of thinking about these things, I'd like to suggest in the few minutes that I have that perhaps it's possible to try and imagine a different set of affairs. Can we imagine a different way of thinking about both tolerance, ecumenicalism, Islam, Muslims, and political settings? And what I mean by political settings here is simply the public sphere, as being something that you do not just in the university or at the home, but you do in society in general. And I want to do this by referring to a quote which a great historian of medieval Islam and medieval Iran, Richard Bulliet, once suggested. He was asked about what he thought the effects of the Iranian Revolution were on Iran. And his reply goes something like this. Without the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Iran would be very much like Pakistan today. And what he said is that you would have a small, liberal, rich elite, which would speak French, maybe even English, who would be connected with the rest of the world, but completely disconnected from the rest of their population, who would live lives which are kind of gilded, but would have very little to do with the rest of their society. You'd have big houses with fantastic amenities, but the streets leading to those houses would be broken, would be sewage, would be on the streets. You'd have rich private individuals, but poor public purse, poor public services. That was the kind of vision that he conjured up with the idea of the Islamic Revolution. Now, that's interesting for three reasons. One, here's a historian talking about history not as something inevitable, but as something that could have happened some different ways. So the idea of history itself becomes no longer something that happens, but it becomes contingent. It becomes a series that it could be different. And in that possibility of something being different, it allows us to think that we can make different contributions there. So that's the first thing I want to take from that. The second thing I would suggest to you is the very idea of Islam and revolution being transformative. Now, you could quibble with the details of that, but the idea that Islam is not just about the status quo, it's not about just preserving what was, but it could have a socially transformative effect, is something, again, which stretches the imagination. Because the imagination of Islam is that, well, it's actually either conservative, retrograde, certainly not socially transformative, more likely to be socially destructive. Yeah? So that's but the third thing that I want to bring from this possibility is really, why pick on Pakistan? There are many, many other examples in the world, and I'm sure there are good reasons for picking on Pakistan. There's always good reasons for picking on Pakistan. But why say it would be like the Gulf? Well, why couldn't it be like Algeria? No, he said Pakistan. Now, part of it could be that there is a kind of an argument that there's a Mughal inheritance, there's a Persianate culture, etc. But I want to try and think about this in relation to Pakistan as a quest for a Muslim homeland, another kind of project where Islam and politics come together. And I want to see this and suggest to you that the reason why he says Pakistan might not just be capricious, there might be something in it that we're thinking about. The thing is this, when you talk about Pakistan, you really are talking, especially its foundation, you're talking about a study in contrast. The story of Pakistan is always told, like all good Bollywood movies, where you have the British Raj, and it has two children. One is successful, one is tolerant, one is secular, one is progressive, and the other, well, what can you talk about it, yeah? And like all good Bollywood movies, this is basically how the structure you have. You have a good country and a kind of a country which has failed. So you have shining India and failing Pakistan. And of course, the complicating feature, of course, with Pakistan is that not only does it fail in relation to India, it fails again in 71 because it splits up into two. Now, the thing about the splitting up of the two points again that countries are not fixed. Countries could be reimagined and can be reconfigured. For example, right now, forget about Kurdistan, look at Catalonia. You could have a independent Catalonia, which would change what it means to be Spain. So there is something here about the position of Pakistan as a project for Muslim homeland, which I think condenses this relationship between politics and Islam. So put it another way. Let's say Muslims can be ecumenical and tolerant like anybody else, because humans can do that. They can be convivial and in convivial settings. But is it possible to have a politics organized around Islam or Muslims which can do the same things? Is it possible to have an ecumenical Muslim homeland? Now, it'd be very easy to look at the history and say, no, it cannot be done. But that, it seems to me, is actually to miss the point. Because what I'm trying to say to you is the history is also not something what has just happened, but what needs to be written. What needs to be written about the future. So, I would say that the idea of Pakistan is actually a very peculiar idea of a Muslim homeland. Because even though you have the two-nation theory, what is this nation this is supposed to be? The Muslims of South Asia are supposed to be a homeland, supposed to be a nation. What makes a nation? Well, the normal kind of parameters of nation by that time had developed was the idea of a common language, common history, common culture, common cuisine. None of these actually pertain. Nor is it the case, like many post-colonial societies, that Pakistan is a recovery of a past story. You can't say it's like Egypt, which is recovering, it's what it always was. There was no Pakistan before 1947. It's not the Mughal Empire, it's not the Delhi Sultanate. It is something completely different and completely new. And in that completely newness of it, I would say to you, it opens up the possibility of imagining different ways of thinking about identity. That even the point about it is that a Muslim identity does not have to be an ethnic identity, does not have to be a linguistic identity, does not have to be exclusionary identity in that way. So what it opens up is the idea that you have two kinds of possibilities. That sometimes the invention of a nation doesn't necessarily need to be an invention of ethnicity. And that the invention of nations can take different kinds of forms and possibilities. And the fact that one invention fails doesn't necessarily tell us much about the reasons for that failure. So for example, and I will conclude with this. Oh, two things to say. The idea of South Asia, the succession of South Asia being initially India and Pakistan, or Pakistan and India, is something that's become so kind of routinized, we imagine it as inevitable. But we know that, for example, there was a possibility that Bengal itself would be a separate country. It was something that the Muslim League under Jinnah was willing to contemplate and accept, but is actually the Congress Party in what is now West Bengal saying that they'd rather not be a united Bengal because they feared to live under Muslim rule, and for Nehru, they'd rather split it rather than be a separate united Bengal. So what all this kind of shows is the kind of contingency around the accidentness around which these things can put together, rather than something narrowly put there. Now you may say that because I'm saying this, I may be saying that sometimes people say, well, the trouble with these societies is that they haven't been sufficiently imagined. There's a whole argument about that there's not a richness of imagination. I would say to you that perhaps what the real issue is, they haven't been sufficiently decolonized. And in that insufficiency of decolonization, I would link up with the presentation Iram gave, the presentations before me. Part of it is that you can't imagine the future if you are unable to liberate yourself from the past. And part of that heritage is a colonial heritage about the construction of knowledge itself. So in a sense, we're coming full circle. If the universities have a future, and I think they should, and they do, they have to be recognized the fact that the modern university emerges at a particular time where it is also where the modern disciplines are organized. And that time, in a sense, may not necessarily be able to, needs to adapt to a different world. So the universities weren't just studying the world, the modern university was also creating that world. And our disciplinary boundaries are a reflection of that. We may be now moving towards a world in which we may require different kinds of disciplinary boundaries, different kinds of organizations of disciplines. And in that sense, decolonization isn't something that stops after 1947 in South Asia or 1961 in Ghana. Perhaps decolonization has to come to the metropole as well. And that, I would say to you, is perhaps one way of thinking about the possibility of the ecumenical that transcends all of this. Thank you very much.